She collapsed beside his car at the stroke of midnight, barefoot and trembling in the cutting chill of an early autumn rain in Chicago, carrying no papers, no name, no memory of who she was. Ethan Rourke should have walked away, should have left her lying there like so many powerful men with shadowed histories might have done without a second thought. Yet instead, he reached for her hand, unaware that from that moment on, this woman would become the only person capable of rescuing the failing heart inside his chest. Rain hammered down on Michigan Avenue as if trying to tear the night open, each drop slicing across his face like the edge of a blade. Ethan had just stepped out of a private club perched high above the city, where he had finished a clandestine meeting with 3 major investors on a biotechnology project he was funding. $30 million sealed with wine and handshakes no one dared refuse. Yet now no one, not even himself, was thinking about money. A sharp pain tore through his chest, starting as a faint scrape beneath his sternum before spreading wide and heavy, rough and merciless, as if something were being crushed inside him by an iron fist. Bracing one trembling hand against the wet brick wall, his breath turned ragged and thin. Since the age of 35, Ethan had known he carried a rare hereditary heart disease that slowly replaced the fibers of the cardiac muscle with scar tissue, weakening him one day at a time. The doctors had told him he had 18 to 24 months. That was spoken 2 years ago. And time, it seemed, had finally run out. Staggering from the shelter of the awning, he moved toward the black SUV parked at the curb, streetlights reflecting in uneven patches across the rain pooled under his feet. His hand trembled as he reached for the keys. Then he froze. Something was wrong. Beneath the dim light, curled beside the rear tire, lay a small figure, drenched through, face pressed to the wet concrete, one arm stretched toward the storm drain, while the other was pinned beneath her body, her dark hair plastered to her cheek, no coat, no shoes, her feet streaked with blood and street grime. It was a frightening sight in the middle of a great city, but not an unfamiliar one, for this was Chicago, and this was 2 a.m. He should have turned away, ignored it, called emergency services, or instructed his driver to deal with it, yet something held him still. A part of him, the instinct sharpened by years of surviving in the underworld, whispered that something about this girl was not just unusual, but strangely familiar. I know her. The thought flashed sharp and quick, like the snap of a breaking heart, but that was impossible. Ethan remembered every face in his world, every ally, every traitor, every debtor, and he was certain he had never seen hers. A violent spasm forced him to his knees against the car door, his grip closing around the handle as he gasped for air. The girl did not move. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, fragile breaths. She was dying. Walk away. Call an ambulance. Get in the car and disappear, the voice in his head barked. But his hand had already opened the back door. Kneeling beside her, he slipped his arms beneath her shoulders. She was far too light, as if her body had not been nourished for weeks. Her skin was cold against his hands, and the touch sent a different ache straight through him. He lifted her into the back seat, her head falling against his shoulder. And in that moment a faint scent drifted toward him. A sterile, crisp, icy smell, like she had stepped out of an operating room. He slid in beside her, his back sinking into the cold leather seat, the ache in his chest tightening again. He reached down for his phone, but his hand failed him, and the device slipped to the floor. Then her eyes opened. A startling shade of blue, luminous even in the dim light, locking onto his with unnerving clarity. "Your pulse," she whispered, her voice rough as if scraped from the bottom of her lungs. Too fast, irregular. Ethan blinked. "What are you talking about?" Her hand rose, resting against his wrist before he could pull away. Her fingers were ice-cold yet steady, finding the exact point of his pulse. She counted. Her gaze drifted slightly, as if processing calculations far beyond simple instinct. "Ventricular arrhythmia," she murmured, the tone precise and clinical. Ethan tried to ask who she was, but before he could speak, her other hand pressed firmly against his chest beneath his collarbone. "Does it hurt?" He nodded. "Breathe with me," she said, and guided him through the pain with the certainty of someone trained to navigate the edge of life and death, counting each breath, steadying each spasm, coaxing the rhythm of his heart back from the precipice with movements too exact and natural to be coincidence. When the pain ebbed and the world sharpened again, Ethan looked at her, this nameless woman without shoes or memory who had saved his life with knowledge she herself could not explain. And for the first time in many years he felt fear, Not of her, but of the question that rose inside him like a tide he did not dare acknowledge. Who is she? And why does a part of me whisper, do not lose her? If you have made it this far with Ethan and Claire, take a moment to subscribe to our channel, tap like, and share this video so we can continue telling stories filled with mystery and emotion every day. And I would love to know, where are you listening from? Leave a comment with your city or country so I can see just how far Ethan and Claire's journey has reached across this wide world. Ethan still felt the echo of her hand against his chest, cool yet unwavering, as if each fingertip carried a muscle memory her conscious mind had forgotten. The pain had receded, leaving an emptiness in its wake that unsettled him more than the suffocation before it. She lowered her hand, breathing hard, her head tilting as though she too had burned through the last of her strength. She looked at him, and this time her blue eyes no longer held frost but a distinctly human fear, a fragile uncertainty without a name. I do not know who I am, she whispered, her gaze darting around the car's interior, as if seeing it for the first time. I cannot remember anything. Ethan narrowed his eyes, studying her like an unsolved riddle. He could still feel the steadiness she had restored to his heartbeat, each rhythm stronger than the one before, as if she had pulled him back from the brink. Yet looking at her now, soaked to the bone, hair clinging to her cheeks, eyes wide with panic and disorientation, he knew she was not only the one who saved him, she was something else entirely, something he could not yet define but could not abandon. Do you remember anything at all? Your name? Your family? Anyone? He asked, keeping his voice steady. She shook her head, her lips trembling. I only knew how to help you breathe. The heartbeat, the compression. It was all reflex. Ethan watched her for several seconds more, then reached for a coat from the front seat and draped it over her shoulders. We will figure this out later. Right now, I need to get you warm before you freeze to death. He stepped out, slid into the driver's seat, and started the engine. Warm air slowly drifted from the vents. She sat in the back, curled into the oversized coat, her arms wrapped around her thin frame. Her face was gaunt, her eyes hollowed like a painting whose defining lines had been erased. Driving down State Street, past gray stone buildings glittering under the rain, Ethan remained silent. Chicago after midnight often held a heavy loneliness, yet tonight the quiet wrapped itself around the SUV like a fragile shell encasing two drifting souls. She said nothing. Ethan did not ask. His mind held too many questions and none with answers. He did not know who she was or where she came from or why she possessed such uncanny, medical precision, but he knew one thing with certainty. He could not leave her behind like a ghost swallowed by the night. When he pulled up to the high-rise overlooking Lake Michigan, the doorman in a black suit hurried forward with an umbrella, yet Ethan waved him off, opening the back door and helping the girl out. She wavered but did not resist. Inside the warm lobby, gold light washed across her pale skin. She stared at the glass ceiling and the modern art lining the walls with the bewildered awe of a lost child. The receptionist looked up but said nothing. Everyone knew Ethan Rourke was not a man people questioned. The elevator to the 37th floor opened in silence. His penthouse was sleek, modern, and quiet, a reflection of the man himself. Ethan guided her to a charcoal gray sofa, fetched warm towels and water from the kitchen. She watched his every movement, wary but no longer panicked. Sitting across from her, he offered the glass. My name is Ethan Rourke. I live here. She accepted the water with both hands and nodded slightly. You do not remember your name, do you? She bit her lip and nodded again. Ethan paused, his gaze searching the depths of her eyes that felt as if they belonged to another lifetime, a memory buried or stolen. Then let me call you Claire for now. Would that be all right? She looked up, startled, as though the name touched something deep inside her, faint yet undeniable. She nodded. Claire, she repeated softly, as if tasting sound for the first time. Ethan rose, went to the wardrobe, and returned with a blanket and clean clothes. You need rest. Tomorrow we will start to understand what happened. Claire watched him, her lips parting as if to form a question, but she remained silent. Ethan turned away, yet caught her reflection in the glass. Something in that quiet moment told him that her arrival was no accident, and if he survived this night, she would be the reason. The first morning unfolded in a strange silence. Ethan could not remember ever experiencing inside this penthouse, while Claire still slept curled beneath a thin blanket on the long sofa beside the wide glass window. the pale, early light filtering through the curtains and brushing her colorless skin, illuminating the bruises around her ankles and the faint scratch along her cheekbone. Ethan watched her from a distance, a cup of coffee untouched in his hand, having called the staff to clean and prepare breakfast, but instructing them not to step into the living room because he did not want anyone to see her in this state, not out of fear of scandal, but because something in her made him want to keep her to himself, like a fragile secret he was not ready to let anyone else disturb. When Claire woke, the first thing her eyes sought was him, and there was no scream, no panic, only a quiet confusion. As if once again she remembered nothing, recognized nothing, yet felt no fear either. Ethan stepped forward, placing a glass of water and a phresis of antested, clean towel on the table before her. "I gave you a temporary name, Claire," he said. "If you do not like it, you may choose another when your real name returns." She looked at him for several long seconds before nodding softly. "Claire is fine," she murmured, her voice still hoarse but clearer than the night before. And for a brief moment Ethan sensed a connection between them that he could not define, not familiarity but something more instinctive, as if fate had arranged something cruel and precise. After a simple breakfast, he took her into his office where his private computer systems were housed, intending to search for her identity through civil databases, hospital archives, and even underground channels. He photographed her face and fed it into an advanced facial recognition program, and the system combed through hundreds of millions of profiles within minutes, before returning absolutely nothing. No name, no residency records, no hospital files, no matches to traffic cameras, security feeds, or public footage from the past 3 years, leaving Claire a ghost who had seemingly never existed. Ethan glanced at her as the results appeared, while she sat by the window clutching the hem of the coat around her, staring toward the misty surface of Lake Michigan, without a flicker of reaction or surprise, simply accepting the void as if it were inevitable, and a tight ache rose in Ethan's chest, though he could not tell whether it was the leftover pain from the night before, or sorrow for something she had just lost forever. "Your file might have been erased," he said quietly, eyes still fixed on the screen. "Maybe someone did not want you to exist on paper anymore." Claire turned toward him. "I have no memories," she whispered, "but I feel," her hand rising to her chest, right where the heart rested beneath, "that I am not a normal person." Ethan moved closer and sat across from her. "You are not normal," he said gently. "You saved my life. The way you checked my pulse, my breathing, the way you diagnosed me, those were advanced medical skills, not instinct." Claire stared at him, her brows furrowing with a mixture of worry and fear. "If I was a doctor, why was I there, barefoot, in the street, in the middle of the night?" Ethan had no answer, though instinct told him nothing about this was random, for instinct had kept him alive in the darkest dealings where a single misread glance could cost blood, and this feeling about Claire carried that same sharp certainty. "You may stay here as long as you want," he said finally, his voice low. "I have spare rooms, medical support if needed, and enough resources to help you find your identity." Her lips parted as if to speak, but she fell silent, though something small flickered in her eyes, perhaps gratitude or perhaps a fragile sense of safety returning for the first time in a long while. Ethan stood and moved toward the door, but as his hand touched the knob, she called softly behind him. "Why are you helping me?" He stopped, not turning, his voice drifting like a faint wind. "Because you did not ask who I am, and because you saved my life before I even knew I needed saving." He left the room, and Claire watched him from the sofa, some quiet tremor moving inside her chest. Not memory, but emotion, as if an invisible thread had just been tied between them. The next morning, Ethan called his private physician, Howard Kramer, an elderly neurologist who had once worked at the Mayo Clinic before becoming a confidential consultant for powerful and discreet clients, and within less than an hour, Kramer arrived at the penthouse carrying a case of portable equipment and the solemn expression of a man who had seen far too many strange things in both medicine and the world of wealth. When Ethan led him into the living room, Claire sat on the long couch by the window wrapped in a thick sweater, her hair washed and lightly dried, her gaze fixed on the fog that hovered above Lake Michigan, and Kramer halted when he saw her, a flicker of something shifting in his eyes. Ethan offered no explanation, only a short nod, for this girl was the reason he was alive, and now the doctor needed to uncover who she was, or at least what had happened to her. "I am Dr. Kramer," he said softly in his warm, steady voice. "I would like to check your health. Nothing frightening." Claire nodded, calmer than on the first day, allowing him to place the blood pressure cuff on her arm, test her reflexes, measure her pulse, and shine a light into her pupils, and all her vital signs remained within normal limits, even surprisingly strong considering her thin frame and lack of rest. But when Kramer lifted the handheld neural scanner and electroencephalography device, he paused, a deep crease forming between his brows as he looked at the small screen. Ethan, standing behind him, recognized that expression immediately. Is something wrong? Kramer did not answer at once, studying Claire again before speaking slowly, selecting each word with care. There is no acute brain injury, no bleeding, no trauma, but there are indications of a past surgical intervention in the left temporal region. He set the device down, gently turning Claire's head and lifting her hair, revealing a tiny scar near the hairline, nearly invisible unless examined closely. This has healed for several weeks to several months, he said. It could be minimally invasive neurosurgery in the midbrain memory region. Ethan's hands tightened. You mean brain surgery? Kramer nodded thoughtfully. Not a common type. More likely a targeted procedure affecting memory storage or emotional regulation. And there is one more thing. He opened his case, taking a quick test biochemical kit, pricked Claire's fingertip, and placed a drop of blood onto the panel. Minutes later, the results appeared on the small screen and he sighed. Her blood contains traces of a sedative compound not approved by the Federal Drug Administration, one that slows central neural activity with long-lasting effects, extremely rare and almost non-existent on the legal market. Claire remained quiet, though her hand tightened in her lap. Ethan watched her, his expression darkening as the pieces began falling into place, still blurred yet clear enough for him to understand that someone had deliberately tampered with her memory, not from trauma or accident, but by intention, because someone did not want her to remember anything at all. Have you ever undergone psychological treatment or surgery? Kramer asked, his tone gentle. Claire shook her head, bewildered. I do not know. I remember nothing, but sometimes I dream of surgical lights, the sound of metal touching metal, and the smell of antiseptic. A cold shiver moved through Ethan's spine, the image of Claire from the night before rising in his mind, her hand on his chest, her voice certain as she named the arrhythmia, and now the question of who possessed both the technology and the motive to erase the memories of a woman with such advanced medical skill grew larger and darker, and why, out of all the streets in Chicago, she had collapsed beside his car on that exact night. Ethan did not believe in fate, but he believed in instinct, and instinct told him, now with crystal clarity, that Claire was at the center of something far bigger than either of them understood. He looked at Kramer, his voice low and decisive. Keep this quiet. No police, no records. She stays here under my protection. Kramer nodded, though his eyes still held a glimmer of concern. I will monitor her regularly, but Ethan, be careful. Someone erased her memory, which means she knew something they are willing to do anything to hide. Claire sat still, her palm resting open on her knee as if holding a fragment of a memory that had drifted through her dreams. And Ethan looked at her for a long time before turning away, already certain of one thing. From the moment her hand touched his heart, everything had changed, not only inside his body but inside the course of his life. That afternoon, after Claire had rested and Kramer had left, Ethan sat alone in his office with the small gray handbag Claire had carried when he first found her on the roadside resting on the desk before him, a bag he had left untouched for 2 full days, partly out of respect for her privacy, and partly because he had not yet been ready to confront whatever truth might be hidden inside it. But after the examination that morning, and the confirmation that her memory had been deliberately altered, he knew he no longer had the luxury of waiting. He opened the bag carefully, his fingers brushing the dried fabric that still held the faint dampness of a sealed and forgotten past, and inside he found only a few belongings: an unopened packet of tissues, a small metal hair clip, a nameless ink pen, and one object that made him pause for a long moment. It was a folded identification badge, with its upper edge torn raggedly as if someone had ripped it violently from a lanyard or collar. Ethan unfolded it and smoothed the creases, the faded print still legible enough to reveal a partial line: Nexicor Medical Research Center. Below it was a photograph of a woman in a white lab coat, her hair pulled neatly back, her gaze direct and unwavering, filled with confidence, and there was no doubt it was Claire, though the name beneath the photo had been scratched away so thoroughly not a single letter remained. Ethan felt a tightening in his chest. Nexicor, a familiar name, but not from financial news. He had heard it months ago during a confidential meeting where investors had whispered about a buried medical scandal. A research center focused on gene therapy and stem cell technologies rumored to be developing treatments for hereditary cardiac diseases and congenital heart mutations. Yet mere weeks later, the name vanished from every report. No press, no lawsuits, no investigations. The entire facility, and everyone inside it, erased as if they had never existed. Ethan set the badge down, his expression darkening, then left the office and walked down the hall toward the living room where Claire stood before the vast glass wall, the golden light of late afternoon spreading across the lake. She turned the moment he approached, as if sensing the shift in the air. "I found this in your bag," he said, handing her the badge. Claire took it, her fingers trembling as they touched the torn edge, her eyes narrowing as she stared at the photograph. And suddenly a violent pounding erupted inside her head, followed by a surge of memories crashing through her mind like a breaking wave. She saw herself in a cold room, bathed in green light, the irregular beeping of a cardiac monitor echoing sharply, a patient on an operating table with the chest already opened, the heart fluttering weakly beneath gloved hands. A voice beside her asked, "Are you sure you calculated the dosage?" Another answered, colder, "I calculated it. Inject it." Claire watched herself step back toward the instrument tray, lifting a small syringe filled with a clear liquid, her hands shaking, and as she turned back, the patient suddenly began seizing, eyes rolling upward, heart rhythm flatlining, and a scream sliced through the room. "She is coding." Claire gasped and dropped the badge, stumbling backward as if struck by an electric shock, and Ethan caught her before she fell. "Did you remember something?" he asked. Claire stared at him, her face drained of color, her eyes unfocused. "Someone died," she whispered. "I was in an operating room. I was a doctor, but I did something, or someone forced me to." Her hand rose to her temple where Kramer had found the faint surgical scar. "I remember the surgical lights, the smell of antiseptic, the sound of a heart stopping, and that scream still echoing in my head." Ethan held her shoulders firmly, his voice steady. "What is Nexicor?" Claire shook her head, but not with certainty. "I do not know exactly, but I was there. I am sure." Ethan bent to pick up the badge, his gaze sharpening like a blade, the decision forming inside him already unshakable. He would find that place, and whatever Nexicor was, and whoever stood behind it, he would drag them into the light, not only for Claire but because the failing heart in his chest had found a new reason to keep beating, and that reason now stood before him, trembling, memoryless, carrying a secret capable of shifting everything. He sat alone in his office again, the badge on the desk beneath the lamp's glow casting a distorted shadow across the glass surface, the name Nexicor swirling in his mind like a curse, reminding him of old rumors whispered in elite circles about a project shut down by the government for unethical biological research. Though no evidence had ever surfaced and the story had vanished in less than a week, Ethan began suspecting Claire had been more than a doctor. The precision of her medical instinct was too sharp, her reflex too, refined, suggesting she may have been part of an advanced research team or worse, directly involved in prohibited experiments. A thought that sent a chill down Ethan's spine even as he refused to ignore it. For the first time since Claire had entered his life, Ethan examined every item in her bag with meticulous care, not out of suspicion, but because he needed to understand what had turned her into a target for memory, erasure, and abandonment in the middle of a stormy night. When he lifted the inner lining, his fingers brushed a small seam, stitched shut with deliberate precision. He made a careful cut and retrieved a cold metal object from within, a USB drive, silver gray, unbranded, unusually heavy as if custom-made. He inserted it into his computer, the system recognizing the hardware instantly, but when opened, a black window appeared demanding a level 3 password. Ethan tried several common strings, then names tied to the badge and Nexicor, but all attempts failed, and after 3 incorrect entries, a warning flashed stating that unauthorized access would delete all data. Ethan stopped immediately, leaning back in his chair, staring at the blinking screen like a silent alarm. The contents of this drive were clearly classified at the highest level, and if Claire had worked in a suppressed project, then whatever hid inside could explain why someone had wiped her memory. Claire entered the room then, pausing at the doorway as she caught the tension in his face. "Did you find something?" she asked softly. Ethan turned and lifted the USB. "In your bag," he said. "It was hidden carefully. Do you remember it?" Claire stepped closer, studying the small device, her brows knitting. "Not clearly, but I feel like I have held it before. It feels familiar." Ethan nodded, his voice low and firm. "It is heavily encrypted, not something an ordinary staff member could access. And if you hid it that well, it had to matter." Claire fell silent for a long moment before whispering, "Maybe. I was trying to protect someone, or expose something." Ethan looked at her, his eyes dark and steady like a lake before a storm, realizing that Claire might not simply be a victim, but perhaps someone who had once walked inside the shadows she was now trying to piece together. Yet what held him in place was the look in her eyes, stripped of calculation, carrying only the fragile expression of a woman trying to mend a life shattered beyond recognition. And he knew he would not let her walk through this alone. Whatever waited ahead, he would be the one to walk beside her until they reached the truth. 3 days later, when every attempt to decode the USB had led them into the same dead end, Ethan realized they had to do the one thing he disliked most, return to where it all began. And though Claire remembered nothing more, each time she saw the word Nexicor, her gaze drifted far away, as if fragments buried deep in her mind were still waiting for the right moment to surface. Using an old contact in the Department of Health, Ethan traced leaked documents from nearly a year earlier and found the coordinates of the former Nexicor Medical Research Center, a facility on the southern edge of Rockford, Illinois. Once funded by a major private health foundation and abruptly shut down for undisclosed reasons, with a brief government investigation that vanished without explanation, no conclusions, no press coverage, as though someone with immense power had sealed the entire affair beneath concrete. Early in the morning, Ethan drove Claire out of Chicago in a silence so dense it felt like fog, her hands clasped tightly together on her lap as she stared out the window, and though neither spoke of what awaited them in Rockford, both understood that if any trace of her true identity still existed, it would be there. When the SUV turned onto the dirt road leading to the Nexicor compound, the sight before them drained the air from the cabin, 2 long U-shaped buildings of glass and gray concrete covered in moss, wild grass rising to the waist, broken signage frames rusted into reddish bone, and an empty parking lot marked only by faint, dissolving tire trails, as if no one had stepped foot here in many months. Ethan stopped the car just short of the gate, cutting the engine as Claire stared at the structure with a shifting expression, something between recognition and dread trembling beneath her skin, and she whispered, "I have been here," though she sounded unsure whether it was memory or instinct. Ethan stepped out first, retrieved a concealed handgun from the back, slid it into his waistband, and handed her a small flashlight. "We look and nothing more. No unnecessary risks." The side door was sealed with a rusted lock he cut open in seconds, and as the heavy door groaned inward, the thick odor of mold and forgotten disinfectant surged out, the unmistakable smell of abandoned medical facilities, where time erases life, but leaves behind the echo of death in every wall. The long hallway stretched into shadow, lined with laboratories stripped of equipment, yet on the counters remained dried flecks of blood and torn specimen labels, printed only with codes, never names. Claire stopped at a room with a cracked glass door, drawn toward it as if pulled by an invisible thread, stepping inside before Ethan could reach her. In the center stood a surgical table bolted to the floor, and overhead hung a skeletal surgical lamp like the ghost of procedures long past, while a handwritten note scrawled in marker still clung to the left wall as if no one had bothered to wipe it clean. When Claire touched the metal table, she recoiled as if burned. "I remember this," she whispered, her voice raw. "I stood here. Someone was lying there. They did not wake up." Ethan saw her shoulders tremble, a silent torment flickering through her eyes that only real memory could produce. They moved on until they reached a records room where Ethan stopped at a cabinet that still bore an intact seal, prying it open to reveal a thick paper file labeled Project Arteria, Top Secret, and clipped at the end was a note reading in hurried handwriting, "Final backup, USB Claire M." Ethan glanced at her, and though she had turned away, her fingers gripped the table edge with white knuckles, leaving no doubt for either of them that this place was the key, and that Claire, whether she remembered or not, had once held the answers. She stood frozen before the open cabinet, her back pressing against the cold wall as her breathing grew rapid and shallow, and Ethan turned just in time to see her eyes widen beneath the flickering neon lights overhead before the storm of memory broke open inside her. A blinding white operating theater flashed before her, monitors screaming in alarm, metal instruments clattering, running footsteps, and a panicked voice shouting, She is going into cardiac arrest. Increase the epinephrine." And Claire saw herself holding a blood-smeared syringe, pushing it into the chest of a young man who convulsed once before collapsing. The smell of cauterized flesh thick in the air, antiseptic mingling with the suffocating scent of fear as the monitor drifted to a flat line. "Lost. Move on to the next patient," someone said coldly behind her, as if a human life meant nothing. And Claire screamed inside the memory, though no one in that room heard her, her hands pressing desperately into the patient's chest, as if one more compression might bring him back. But her hands shook uncontrollably, blood leaking through her mask onto her lips, and the long, unbroken drone of the monitor carved itself into her mind like a blade. "Claire!" Ethan shouted, grabbing her shoulders when her body swayed. But she no longer heard him. More images surged through her. A pale woman in her 40s whispering for help. A teenage boy clutching the sheets until his fingers bled. An elderly man gripping her hand as he released his final breath behind the mask. Each memory ending the same way, each life slipping away under her hands, while she struggled to save them with a gene therapy the system forced her to administer. No, I do not want to. I did not want to do this," Claire sobbed, collapsing as Ethan pulled her into his arms. Her entire body shook with such violence he could feel each tremor through his own ribs as he held her tightly, whispering, "Look at me, Claire. Look at me. You are here with me. There are no patients here, just you and me." But the visions kept dragging her under, the bright lab overlapping with the decaying Nexicor ceiling above them, the smell of blood creeping back into her nose, the screams of commands pounding through her skull. They all died in my hands," she choked, and Ethan wrapped his arms around her more firmly, steadying her breath with slow strokes along her spine, feeling each fractured inhale fight its way out of her. "You did not kill them," he murmured. "You tried to save them. You did everything you could." But Claire shook her head violently, tears soaking into his shoulder. "No, Ethan, it was the gene therapy. I injected it. I did it. I followed orders, and they died, one after another." The words "one after another" hit him like a revelation. In that instant he understood. She had not been the perpetrator, but the vessel forced to carry the guilt of someone else's design, coerced into becoming the instrument of a deadly protocol. Her healing hands turned into a weapon against her will. Claire gasped for air, collapsing fully against him. "They called it experimental gene therapy," she said through sobs. "They said it was their only chance. But I knew after the third case it was killing them." Ethan stroked her hair, his voice dropping into a low, steady vow. "And they made you continue." Claire nodded weakly, her lips trembling. "They said if I refused they would reset me, erase my memory again." Ethan closed his eyes, the horror of it sinking into him like ice. This was no longer speculation, but a truth unraveling before them. Claire trapped in a manufactured nightmare, forced to administer a lethal treatment and wiped clean each time she resisted. She clutched her head, gasping like someone pulled from deep water. "Ethan, I watched them die, all of them, and I could not save anyone." Ethan lifted her face, guiding her eyes to his. "You remembered, Claire. That is the first step. And I swear to you, you will not face any of this alone." She broke into exhausted, shattering sobs, clinging to him with the desperation of someone fighting to stay above the darkness, pulling her under. And there in the cold, abandoned halls of Nexicor, surrounded by the ruins of hidden horrors, she held on to Ethan as if he were the only real thing left tethering her to the world, as her past rose up at last to consume her. The panic slowly ebbed until only soft, broken sobs lingered in Claire's throat, the fading echoes of a storm that had torn through every fragile barrier she had, once built to protect herself from the truth she was never meant to face. And Ethan remained there with one arm wrapped tightly around her, while the other gently smoothed her hair, anchoring her to a reality as thin as a thread. They sat that way for a long while in the heavy silence thick with the scent of old dust and secrets never meant to see the light of day. And when Claire finally lifted her head, her eyes were still red, swollen from the force of memory. Yet something inside them had changed, no longer hollow, no longer shaped by fear alone, but filled with a striking clarity, as though a locked door deep within her mind had finally swung open after years of darkness. She blinked several times as if testing whether the room, the man holding her, and her own breath were real, then placed her hand on her chest where her heart continued to beat in steady rhythm beneath the fabric. "Claire Monroe," she whispered, her voice hoarse yet certain, and Ethan tilted his head slightly, watching her with quiet intensity. "What did you say?" She met his gaze, and for the first time there was grounding there, an anchor, as though she had at last grasped the roots of who she truly was. My real name is Claire Monroe. I am a doctor, not just someone with medical skill, but a cardiac surgeon. I worked here, at Nexicor. The words sliced cleanly through the dense fog that had clouded her mind for days, and Ethan stared at her, stunned, though part of him had already suspected it. But hearing her say it, with such unwavering conviction, made everything suddenly tangible. Claire rose slowly to her feet, stepping toward the center of the abandoned room as though every brick, every shadowed corner, every faint stain on the wall called back some buried part of her life, and she turned toward the whiteboard affixed to the wall whose surface had been mostly wiped clean, but under the weak light from the broken window still showed the faint ghosts of medical notes once written there. I stood here every day, she murmured, explaining procedures, guiding the surgical team. I led the group responsible for the gene intervention therapy for late-stage cardiac regeneration. Her hand drifted unconsciously to her abdomen as if following an old reflex. We believed we could save people with no hope left, that we were changing medicine. Ethan stepped closer, his voice low. But it did not go the way they claimed, did it? Claire gave a faint nod, her gaze drifting outward. At first the results were promising. We saved 2, maybe 3 early patients. Their heart muscle began contracting again. No transplants required, no waiting lists. But then their bodies began to react. The immune system attacked the altered cells. They went into arrhythmia, into internal hemorrhage. None survived more than 2 weeks. She paused, her breath trembling. I submitted reports. I asked to halt the project, but I did not know that was when everything began to disappear. Colleagues reassigned, without explanation. Files erased. And then, she touched the scar angled behind her left ear. I disappeared from my own life. Ethan took her hand, gripping it firmly. Maybe you backed up everything before they got to you. Maybe you hid evidence, which is why they wiped your memory. Claire looked at him, and something fierce and bright sparked behind her eyes. Not fear, but resolve, as if the terror had finally made room for certainty. We have to uncover the whole truth, not just for me, but for those who died without anyone knowing their names. They deserve to be remembered, even once. Ethan nodded. No further promise required. And in that moment, inside the dust-filled room where a buried past still clung to the walls, Claire Monroe was no longer the lost woman who had stumbled barefoot through a Chicago storm. She stood again as herself, a doctor, a witness, a woman carrying the weight of blood and truth in equal measure, and Ethan understood that the real journey had only just begun. That very night, once they returned to Chicago, Ethan called one of the most formidable security experts in his network, a former engineer from the National Security Agency, who now accepted only discreet assignments with 6-figure compensation, and without asking many questions, the man agreed to one task: decode the USB drive and keep its contents confidential. After 3 hours of uninterrupted work in a dimly lit sealed room, with lines of gray code falling across the monitor like sheets of rain, the system finally broke through the triple encryption, and when the files opened, Ethan and Claire stepped forward simultaneously, eyes fixed on the screen whose pale blue glow felt colder than the night beyond the windows. The data revealed a collection of internal medical reports, each tied to a patient code, detailing pre-existing conditions, the gene therapy regimen, monitoring logs, and finally the fatal outcomes. Claire sat down, her hands clasped tightly on her knees as she read each document, each chart, each heart rhythm strip, each immune response index. Every detail she knew too well, yet now struck her like a blade twisting into the fragments of memory newly revived. 15 patients, all dead within less than 3 weeks of receiving the therapy. The youngest, a 12-year-old girl with dilated cardiomyopathy. The oldest, a 63-year-old veteran in late-stage heart failure. And in every file the signatures of the research team appeared, with one name repeated again and again. Dr. Claire Monroe, lead clinician, primary investigator. She held her breath as her gaze slid to the final line of each report. The cause of death summarized with chilling brevity: acute immune shock, ventricular arrhythmia, myocardial rupture, all severe negative responses to the original gene therapy. Alongside the main folder sat a hidden directory protected with a separate password, and when prompted, Claire did not hesitate, typing in 6 words: Arteria Revised, Protocol. The document opened to reveal a revised therapy proposal written by her own hand, and Claire went still. She remembered writing this. During the weeks her suspicion had sharpened into certainty. It was the culmination of sleepless nights, of collecting tissue reaction samples from patients in secret, analysis conducted without approval because she knew something was terribly wrong. Her proposal presented a fully restructured gene sequence designed to prevent immune collapse, with phased dosing rather than a single injection. She had prepared everything for the next trial, awaiting only approval, but the very next week all her access had been revoked. The project supervisor had avoided her, and within 7 days she had vanished. Ethan kept his gaze on the screen, but his attention shifted to Claire, who now stared at her own words as though looking into a mirror held up by time, and in that moment he understood she had not merely been part of the project, she had been ahead of them. She had found a way to save lives, but they had not allowed her to try. "They never intended to let you run this protocol," Ethan said quietly. Claire nodded without looking away, because if it worked, they would have had to admit the original therapy was a failure, and those 15 people, they were victims. Ethan took her hand in his, gripping tightly. "Now we have evidence," he said, "and you have what no one else has, the ability to complete it." Claire lifted her eyes, and there in their depths was a fire he had not seen before. No longer fear, no longer confusion, only a woman who had just rediscovered her purpose, her identity, her fight. "We will finish it," she said softly. "Not for glory. For them. And for you." Ethan looked at her and understood in that moment that she was not just the reason his heart still beat inside his chest. She was the beginning of something deeper than survival itself, a promise, and the start of everything yet to come. Ethan remained still as he stared at the screen where Claire's revised protocol proposal was still open. The once clinical medical terminology now carrying a weight he had never allowed himself to acknowledge, and somewhere deep inside him something long buried stirred like a truth finally demanding to be spoken. For months he had lived beneath the quiet shadow of a sentence he never shared with anyone, not even with Luca or the most trusted men in his circle, the genetic dilated cardiomyopathy that had followed him since adolescence, the same illness that had claimed his father suddenly and brutally, and now was slowly consuming the final steady beats of his own heart. Ethan had always believed he would not live beyond 40, and as a result he had never planned for a life that stretched far ahead. His world had been made of transactions, power, control, and loneliness. But now, watching Claire sit beside him with eyes lit not by fear but by a fragile and dawning conviction, he felt the truth he had avoided, for so long pulling him back to himself. He walked slowly toward the window, the last light of day glinting across his face like the outline of a confession. "Claire," he said quietly, every word released as though torn from a hidden wound, "I have never told anyone about this, but now, I think you need to know." She turned toward him, her brows tightening ever so slightly, as though she sensed the shift in the air. Ethan placed his hand on his left chest, the place where dull aches often surged at night, or when anger stole his breath. "I have genetic dilated cardiomyopathy, the same condition as most of the patients in Nexicor's files. It makes the heart lose its ability to contract. It killed my father when he was 38, and now I am approaching that threshold." Claire said nothing, only stood there with a stunned, quiet stillness, her gaze locked on his as if seeing him anew. "I have known for years," he continued. "The doctors told me that without a transplant I would not live past 40. But with who I am, with my life, and my name, joining a transplant list is impossible. And I never believed I would live long enough to need another heart." Claire stepped closer, her hand finding his and holding it firmly. "And you lived as if you had nothing to lose." Ethan nodded, a half-smile tugging at his mouth, though his eyes carried the depth of a man who had held the truth alone for far too long. "Until you walked into my life, unexpectedly, almost impossibly, and everything changed." She tightened her grip, her hand trembling softly. "Ethan, the therapy you are talking about, it is the one we tried to create, and I am the last person who remembers how to make it right." Ethan turned to her, letting her see the weariness he usually hid beneath the armor of a man no one could touch. "If anyone can save me, it is you." Claire shook her head, tears rising not out of fear but out of the understanding of what her presence now meant. Not just the 15 lives lost, not just the stolen dignity of a healer, but the life of the man who had held her through terror and trusted her when she could not trust herself. "I failed once," she whispered, But if there is even a single chance to make it right, I will do everything." Ethan raised a hand and brushed her cheek, wiping away a tear that had begun to fall. "I do not need you to save me because I deserve it. I need you to save me because you believe you can." Claire nodded slowly, her eyes steady, resolute, and stronger than the fear that once defined her. "Then we start tomorrow. No more running, no more fear. We will rebuild this therapy, and this time, it will not fail." Ethan smiled, and in that moment his heart, worn and tired, beat hard and alive again, not from fear, but from a hope newly kindled in the presence of a woman named Claire Monroe, the only person who understood the very illness, stealing his life one beat at a time. Their conversation stretched until near dawn, the soft golden light of the workroom never dimming as Claire redrew the new genetic protocol step by step on the large whiteboard, and for the first time in days she was not dragged back by fragments of trauma, but focused entirely on the lines before her, as though every cell in her body had awakened with the memory of who she once was. Ethan sat at the desk behind her, watching the quiet intensity with which she worked, and he knew without a shadow of doubt that if anyone could complete what Nexicor had buried, it was Claire. But in the middle of that fragile piece, something shifted, whether instinct or the sharpened habits of a man who had lived too long in the shadows. Ethan sensed it immediately. He rose, moving quickly into the hallway leading to the main entrance. The security system still showed everything normal, but when he opened the computer linked to the building's external cameras, a single image made his entire body tighten. A black SUV without license plates was parked only a block away. Two men in long coats, standing behind the half-open trunk, one holding a signal-scanning device. Ethan shut the monitor and turned swiftly toward the living room. Claire looked up, about to ask something, but the tension in his face stopped her. "Pack your things. Now. No questions." She froze only for a heartbeat, then stepped into action, grabbing her notes and the USB drive, tucking them into a leather bag. Ethan rushed into the bedroom, opened the safe, and removed a stack of cash and a concealed handgun. When they met at the foyer, there was no panic, only the shared understanding of two people who had already crossed the thin line between survival and the unknown. They stepped into the private elevator leading to the underground garage where Ethan's Range Rover waited. There were no sirens, no pounding footsteps, but Ethan knew this kind of hunt did not announce itself. These were not police. They were hired operatives, silent and efficient, whose job was to erase problems, not arrest them. And their target was Claire Monroe. The vehicle rolled out of the building through the rear exit, bypassing public cameras and main checkpoints, and Ethan drove at a steady pace, fast enough to slip their signal, but not fast enough to draw attention. "Where are we going?" Claire asked as the city lights faded behind them. "A villa at Geneva Lake. It is deep in the woods, fully isolated. No ties to any property in my name. Only Luca knows and he will not talk." Claire nodded, holding the leather bag tightly against her chest, everything she had left of her life inside it. They drove for nearly 3 hours as light rain began to fall when they reached the southern rim of Wisconsin, and the villa appeared at the end of a winding dirt road through tall pines, its low stone walls and warm yellow porch lights giving off a peace neither of them had felt in days. The moment Claire stepped inside, she exhaled, shedding a weight she had carried too long. No sirens, no cameras, only falling leaves, and the faint scent of pine in the air. Ethan checked the perimeter and security systems, while Claire spread her notes across the wooden table. And although only hours had passed since they had been in the Chicago penthouse, the air between them felt irrevocably changed. There was no more time for fear. Every minute brought them closer to the truth. When Ethan returned, he found Claire marking critical sections of the revised protocol, and she no longer resembled the nameless woman lost in the Chicago rain. She was Dr. Claire Monroe, the woman who had once dared to challenge a system to save the forgotten dying. Ethan sat across from her, placed his hand on the papers, and spoke in a voice steady and unwavering. "From this moment on, this place is our lab, our refuge, our last line of defense. Are you ready?" Claire looked at him without a second of hesitation. "I have been ready since the moment you believed in me, even when I could not believe in myself." Outside, the rain grew heavier, striking the roof like a warning. But inside the villa hidden in the forest, two souls carrying pain and conviction laid the first stone of something neither dared name aloud: hope and resistance. The early days at the Geneva Lake Villa unfolded in the profound stillness of the surrounding forest, broken only by the wind brushing against the old window frames. and though the world outside seemed frozen in place, the small stone house held within it a breathless race between hope and death. Claire scarcely left the main room that had been transformed into a makeshift research lab, where on a long oak table lay dozens of hand-drawn diagrams, charts, chemical formulas, and reconstructed tissue simulations pulled from the depths of memories once held captive behind walls of forced forgetfulness. She worked without pause, her eyes ringed with fatigue, her fingers stained with ink and cooled coffee, and every stroke of the marker against the whiteboard felt like turning a page in a book she had once written but could no longer fully recall. At times she closed her eyes, retracing enzyme structures or chain reactions she had once memorized with the ease of habit, now relearning the essence of her own mind with a sense of urgency greater than any emergency that had ever filled an operating room. Ethan never interfered, taking instead the quiet burden of every other task, preparing food, securing the perimeter, sending minimal coded updates to Luca to ensure all movement from Chicago remained scrambled, and he watched Claire from a distance, covering her with a blanket when she fell asleep at her desk, sitting quietly to listen to the fragile, steady rhythm of her breathing. And it was in those moments he realized how much he had changed, that the man who once lived only for power and control now stood helpless before something far larger, the fragile beat of his own failing heart, and the quiet love he carried for the woman fighting to keep it alive. By the 5th day, Claire set her pen down with a weary exhale, and Ethan, who had been standing on the porch with a cup of coffee, stepped inside immediately. "Is something wrong?" he asked, and she turned toward him with eyes exhausted yet burning with resolve. "I have rebuilt almost the entire formula," she said. "Without a real lab, we cannot simulate it properly, but in theory the serum can be recreated. I recalculated the immune response, reduced the dosage, and added regulatory enzymes to slow the gene conversion. It is safer, at least on paper." Ethan placed the cup aside and moved closer, his eyes fixed on her face. "Do you think it can work?" Claire nodded, though uncertainty lingered in her voice. "I cannot know until we try, and we do not have a lab for tissue testing or animal trials." She paused, hesitant. "It requires a real human body." Ethan was silent for a long moment before gently taking her hand. "Then let it be me." Claire stared at him, her voice breaking. "No, Ethan, you cannot. We have not tested anything. It could trigger shock, or worse. You do not understand." Ethan tightened his grip. "I do understand. You said that without treatment I will not survive more than a few months. You also said this is the only chance. So why not now? If I die, at least I die for something that matters. And if it works, we could save thousands." Claire shook her head, tears welling. "I cannot let you do that. Not because I fear failure, but because I fear losing you forever." Ethan touched her cheek, wiping away the tear that slipped free. "I have nothing to lose except you, and I do not want to wait until this body forces me to surrender. I want to be the first person who believes in you, believes in what Nexicor tried to bury." Claire pressed her forehead against his chest, overwhelmed by fear and gratitude, and outside the evening rain began to fall softly over the villa roof, offering a mournful counterpoint to the decision forming between them. In the arms of the man whose heart was tiring one beat at a time, she knew the theories on paper no longer belonged to a distant world. She was about to wager everything, and the one placing the bet was the man she loved. Life at the secluded Geneva Lake Villa soon settled into a quiet rhythm that felt almost unreal, with no traffic, no hurried footsteps in clinical corridors, no cold commands echoing from Nexicor's conference rooms, only the whisper of wind through pines, the soft call of morning birds, and at times the faint sigh of hope slipping through Claire's weary breath. Each day she plunged deeper into the pile of documents, drafts, and reimagined medical studies salvaged from a memory repeatedly altered, and the villa's living room became a temporary laboratory, with a long work table serving as her station for mixing solutions, a portable centrifuge, test tubes, and the biological measuring tools Ethan had discreetly transported through safe channels from Chicago, hidden within crates, labeled as vintage camera parts or automobile components to bypass local scrutiny. Claire woke before dawn with a cold cup of coffee in hand, eyes locked on the papers spread before her, and the fear that once clouded her gaze was gone, replaced by the sharp focus of a seasoned cardiac surgeon searching through every scientific crevice for a way to save the one life she could not afford to lose. Ethan spent his days monitoring the forest perimeter and maintaining sparse communication, knowing silence was their strongest shield. And each afternoon he prepared simple meals, setting them beside her as she muttered phrases like CRISPR-Cas, IL-6 inhibitors, and modified RNA vectors between bites taken absent-mindedly. One evening, after nearly 12 hours without stepping away from the table, Claire stretched, closed her eyes briefly to steady herself, and turned toward the whiteboard, where the complete outline of the new serum lay sketched from end to end, the final version of what she, now called Arteria Revive, a hybrid born from Nexicor's original gene therapy and the improvements she had once proposed before they stripped her mind clean. This time she had replaced the entire enzyme chain, designed a biodegradable biological buffer, and altered cellular activation timing so that the cardiac regeneration would unfold slowly, steadily, without the catastrophic immune shock that had claimed every previous patient. She printed the final protocol, reviewed it step by step, knowing a single miscalculation could erase the man she loved forever. Ethan entered the room as she scribbled the last notes, standing quietly behind her with a reverence that felt like a vow. "It is ready," Claire murmured without turning, her voice low and rough. "Ready in theory. Now everything depends on the biology of one human body. And you are the only case we have." Ethan placed his hand on her shoulder, grounding her with a gentle pressure. "I trust you. I always have." Claire lifted her eyes to meet his, and in that moment every equation, every diagram, every calculation dissolved into something far simpler. Love. Not the impulsive or fragile kind, but the love of two people who had walked through darkness and found each other in the farthest corner of their loneliness. That night, Claire placed each serum vial in a steel tray, checked the temperature controls, and prepared a set of manual heart monitoring tools she had once relied on in her earliest intern days, for there were no advanced machines here, no medical team, only a failing heart waiting to be saved and another heart that could not bear to lose it. Ethan sat still in the leather armchair, shirt unbuttoned at the collar, arm extended across the wooden table, ready for the first injection. Claire stood before him with the syringe in her hand, the amber liquid shimmering faintly beneath the warm lamp, her heart pounding painfully in her chest, yet her hands did not tremble this time, for nothing was more frightening than doing nothing at all. And she had already made her choice. She would begin again, with the very hands once forced to take life, now becoming the final hope to save it. The next morning arrived under a veil of thick mist that wrapped itself around the pine trees surrounding the villa, turning the world outside into a muted watercolor landscape, as though reality itself had been pushed away from the small sanctuary where they now lived. Ethan sat at the wooden desk in the small study, the soft glow of the desk lamp casting warm light across his face, a face that normally held calm control but now carried a quiet heaviness he could not hide. Before him lay a neatly bound stack of documents, his will, his asset directives, and the final medical instructions should the worst happen. Claire stood near the doorway, watching in silence as he signed page after page, her fingers gripping the hem of her sweater until her knuckles turned white, each signature a silent wound in her chest, for even if he said nothing, she knew Ethan was preparing for the possibility of never waking up again. When he signed the final page, he lifted his eyes to her, and in them was a gentleness intertwined with unwavering resolve. "I am not doing this because I am afraid," he said softly. "I just do not want you to face everything alone if things go wrong. This is the first time in my life I have placed absolute trust in someone, and if it is also the last time, I will still have no regrets." Claire moved toward him, lowered herself into the chair opposite, and took his hand in both of hers, holding on as if anchoring him to life. "You will not die, Ethan. Not while I am still breathing. I already lost everything once, my memories, my name, my work. I cannot lose you too." Ethan looked into her eyes, then lifted a hand to her cheek, brushing a thumb along the warm skin where tears trembled. "You know, from the night you appeared beside my car, my heart beat differently, not because of the illness, but for another reason entirely. You made me believe I might deserve to live a real life, not just exist in the shadows, and if I had the choice I would still open that car door that night, even knowing everything that would follow." Claire let out a choked laugh through her tears. "You are foolish, but so am I, because I think I loved you from the moment you handed me that cup of warm water and sat beside me without asking a single question." Ethan leaned forward and pressed a slow, deliberate kiss to her forehead, a kiss that carried trust rather than urgency, a vow rather than desire. In that still moment, every doubt dissolved, leaving only two people with one purpose: to walk together across the fragile line between life and death. Claire opened the serum case and checked one last time the concentration of enzymes and the stability of the solution. The serum shimmered a deep amber, neither foaming nor crystallizing, exactly as the theory required. She drew the first dose and locked it into the automatic injector Ethan had acquired through a quiet medical supply route. Ethan lay back on the long leather chair, unbuttoning the top two buttons of his shirt, his hand resting over his left chest, the place where countless times he had thought he was feeling his final heartbeat. Claire pulled on her gloves, rechecked his vital signs, then leaned close enough that he could feel the steadiness of her breath. "If you feel anything strange or uncomfortable, you tell me immediately. I will be here the entire time." Ethan nodded, his gaze unnervingly calm. "I am not afraid. Not if you are the last person I see should I close my eyes." Claire swallowed hard, then pushed the plunger, sending the first drops of serum into his bloodstream. In less than 2 minutes, Ethan's face lost all color, cold sweat beading across his forehead and temples. Claire hovered close, her hands never leaving the blood pressure cuff and heart monitor beside him. 1 minute, 2 minutes. His heart began to misfire, but not beyond the limit she feared. Claire steadied her breathing, adrenaline syringe ready but unused. At the 5th minute, Ethan's heartbeat slowed, then leveled, then deepened in a way that seemed almost impossible. His eyes regained focus, lifting slowly to meet hers, as though waking from a long sleep. Claire broke into tears, her hand trembling as she pressed her palm against his chest, feeling the newly steadied beat beneath warm skin. Ethan gave a faint smile, placed his hand over hers, and held on. They did not need words. The serum had worked, and for the first time in many years, his heart beat with something like certainty. Yet the moment the serum finished entering his bloodstream, another wave struck, a cold shock knifing through his body like plunging into ice water, followed by a violent burn that surged from his chest to the tips of his fingers, an invisible current ripping through him cell by cell. Ethan arched involuntarily, his jaw clenching hard, veins standing out on his hands as he gripped the edge of the chair. Claire tightened her hold on his arm, eyes glued to the monitor, her other hand hovering over the emergency medication. Less than a minute later, the first convulsion hit, his chest contracting sharply, heart racing into a dangerous rhythm. Claire's breath came fast, her mind scanning through every calculation she had made, while Ethan groaned, the sound low and strained, his face drenched in sweat, eyes squeezed shut as though the entire weight of his body were fighting an invisible force from within. 2 minutes passed with no improvement. Claire bit her lip hard enough to draw blood, her hands trembling but precise, as she adjusted readings and resisted the rising panic she knew would kill them both if she let it take over. She understood this was the critical threshold, when the immune system decided whether to attack or accept the altered gene sequence invading his damaged heart tissue. Ethan let out another sound, deeper, more ragged, as though a metal fist were crushing his chest. Claire pressed her hand against his sternum, feeling the frantic thrum beneath, whispering, though she did not know whether the plea was meant for him or for the serum itself. "Just a little longer." 3 minutes. Ethan began panting, pulse dropping dangerously low yet not disappearing. Claire shifted to check the carotid pulse and pupil reaction. Still present, she held off on the adrenaline, choosing to trust the stabilizing enzyme chain she had designed, a gamble with stakes measured only in the life of the man she loved. 4 minutes. His heartbeat slowed again, uneven, pausing in small, terrifying gaps that made Claire stop breathing each time the monitor blinked red. But from each pause, the beat returned, slower, deeper, truer. Claire leaned down, pressing the stethoscope to his chest, listening not to the machine now but with her own ears, letting each beat strike her like a miracle. 5 minutes. His pulse stabilized. Blood pressure rose from its dangerous dip. Oxygen levels climbed. The tremors ceased. No arrhythmia, no shock, no sign of anaphylaxis. Claire collapsed to her knees beside the chair, burying her face in her hands as tears streamed down in a delayed wave of everything she had held back. Ethan drew a long breath and opened his eyes, heavy with exhaustion yet bright with unmistakable life. He managed a small smile. "I am still here." Claire broke into a half-laugh, half-sob, throwing her arms around him and holding him as though anchoring him to the earth, her cheek pressed to the warm skin above his newly strengthened heart. They spoke no more. They did not need to. The serum had worked. Claire had done it. And Ethan, who had lived for years under the shadow of a silent death sentence, could breathe again as a man given a second chance. But they both knew this fragile moment of peace would not last. Somewhere beyond the tree line, danger was drawing nearer, and the heart she had just saved would soon face a trial far more brutal than any pain it had borne before. That night, after Ethan's heartbeat finally steadied, Claire forced herself to remain calm as she monitored his vital signs for several more hours. She checked his pulse, measured his blood pressure again, recorded every possible side effect, and compared each detail with her medical theory to confirm one critical truth. The serum was fully integrating with his body. Once every indicator held steady within a safe margin, Claire let Ethan rest on the bed in the master room while she sat in the chair by the window, writing down the essential steps of the trial, as she watched the darkness slowly swallow the forest beyond the glass. The Geneva Lake night was colder than usual, wind rushing through the wooden seams of the villa and producing a thin, eerie whistle Claire first mistook for the heightened sensitivity of exhaustion. But when the faint metallic click echoed from somewhere in the distance, she lifted her head sharply. That was not the wind, it was the sound of movement. She stood, walked quickly to the security panel hidden behind a wall painting, and checked the surveillance feeds. The 4 exterior cameras were still connected, but the one covering the eastern tree line flickered twice before the signal vanished entirely. Claire grabbed her phone and entered the emergency code to Luca. In less than 30 seconds, a brief message returned. "Leave. They have found you." She rushed into the bedroom and gently shook Ethan awake, her whisper tight with urgency no caution could mask. "Ethan, wake up. We have a problem." He opened his eyes, still worn from the earlier agony, but alert within seconds. "How long?" "Not more than 10 minutes." Claire helped him stand, then ran to the storage room, grabbed 2 handguns and a portable battery pack. Ethan pulled on his jacket and caught her hand, his voice low and sharp with resolve. "They will not let you walk away. Not this time." She met his stare, unyielding. "Then we will not make it easy for them to take either of us." Outside, from the edge of the woods, came the grinding crunch of tires rolling over dry leaves. An armored truck without plates stopped about 50 meters from the villa, followed by 3 black SUVs, each with bulletproof windows and darkened headlights. Within a minute, a team of men dressed head to toe in black tactical gear fanned out in a tight semicircle, weapons raised. Behind them, a smaller, slower-moving group advanced, their steps measured, their eyes cold. Through a compact scope, Claire caught the emblem of a white wolf stitched onto their sleeves, the mark of the Eastern European Bratva that had once provided dirty biosecurity contracts to Nexicor. Ethan checked his ammo and drew a slow breath. "We do not have much ammunition, but they do not know that. We just need to buy time until Luca arrives." Claire nodded, secured the locks, and activated the villa's electronic defense system, though she knew it would only stall the enemy for a few minutes at best. The first gunshot shattered the night like thunder. Glass exploded across the foyer as a rain of bullets tore through the living room, but Claire and Ethan had already slipped back into the stone-walled hallway. Ethan fired 2 quick shots. One attacker dropped less than 5 meters from the door. The other pulled back and signaled his team to flank the house. Claire dragged Ethan toward the kitchen, opened the door that led to the old wine cellar now converted into a hidden escape route. But as they descended the stairs, an explosion slammed through the back wall of the villa, shaking dust loose from the ceiling. A second team had breached from the rear, pressing forward with a pincer strategy. Ethan fired back but staggered, dizziness overtaking him. Claire caught him, pressing a cloth over the small cut on his shoulder where shattered glass had sliced through. Before she could move again, another burst of gunfire erupted outside, but this time it was not coming from the enemy. It was friendly. A convoy of vehicles stormed in from the western road, headlights slicing through the mist. Luca and his heavily armed team arrived just in time, encircling the Bratva from behind. Gunfire rattled through the trees, shouts mixing with clipped commands in Russian. Claire pulled Ethan through the cellar entrance as the firefight spread across the property. They hid behind the thick stone wall, their eyes meeting for a brief heartbeat, a shared promise held in silence. They would not give up. Not tonight. Not after coming this far. In the smoke and shadow, Ethan's heart still beat steadily. One beat, then another, slow, solid, alive. The gunfire was still raging as Claire dragged Ethan behind the villa's rear stone barrier, her breath sharp, her palms slick with blood she could no longer distinguish as his or her own. Luca emerged from the trees with more than 10 armed men. half of whom were former special forces from international private units. He signaled his formation to sweep out in a widening arc, slicing across the Bratva flank from the west, forcing the enemy into the open courtyard now littered with haze and the flicker of tactical laser lights. Claire heard a faint groan from near the kitchen hallway and dropped to her knees, discovering one of Ethan's men bleeding heavily from a wound in his abdomen, blood soaking into the wooden floor. The young soldier was still conscious, fear and pain flashing across his eyes as she approached. Claire tore off her belt to create a makeshift tourniquet, then cut open the torn body armor to inspect the wound. The fragment had not gone deep, but it sat dangerously close to the aorta. "Do not speak. Breathe. I am a doctor," she said quietly but firmly. She rinsed the wound with saline from her emergency kit and began stitching the torn tissue quickly to stop the bleeding until they could evacuate him safely. Outside, gunfire continued but softened. Luca shouted into his radio, calling for reinforcements from the southern post and allies from Milwaukee. Their force could hold, but unless the Bratva's escape routes were sealed, they would regroup and return for a guerrilla strike once the element of surprise faded. A sudden explosion erupted from the garage. One of the Bratva had detonated a grenade, destroying Ethan's backup vehicle to block their retreat. The villa shook with the impact, dust billowing as Claire shielded the wounded soldier. She yelled for Ethan, who was crawling toward her, fighting through dizziness, his willpower forcing his body to obey. Before the dust settled, Luca's team counterattacked with fierce precision. 2 snipers hidden in the hills took out most of the remaining Bratva gunmen, while the assault group flanked from both sides, splitting the enemy formation completely. One man tried to break for the trees through a smokescreen, but he fell before reaching 10 meters. The last shots echoed like the closing lines of a brutal chapter. Claire carried the injured soldier outside as Luca's team secured the grounds. Her gaze swept over the surviving faces before finding Ethan leaning against a thick wooden beam, his shirt torn, his expression cold and sharp, the heart inside his chest beating with renewed strength. One of Luca's men reported that nearly the entire enemy unit had been neutralized, with only 2 taken alive for interrogation. Claire sank onto the stone steps, her hands covered in blood and dirt, exhaustion washing through her in a long, shaking breath. Luca approached, placed a hand on her shoulder, and for the first time in weeks, there was genuine respect in his eyes. "Without you," he said, "our men would not have survived, and neither would Ethan." Claire gave a faint nod, then looked toward Ethan. He crossed the small distance, sat beside her, and took her hand, holding it firmly without a word. In the dim light of a dawn beginning to rise beyond the trees, they sat amid the wreckage, surrounded by the living, with a heart that had been saved and a resolve stronger than any weapon their enemies could wield. The attackers had been repelled, but Claire knew this was not the end. It was only the first time they had earned the chance to decide their own fate, and she would not back down again. When morning fully broke and the first sunlight fell across the villa roof, still dusted with smoke and ash from the attack the night before, Claire sat alone in the small study, staring at the laptop screen, where the final lines of decoded internal Nexacore data glowed against the dimness. The flash drive had been cracked open completely after Luca's tech team worked alongside a former government cybersecurity specialist, and what they uncovered was not only the list of 15 patients who died from the faulty gene therapy, but the entire record of illegal experimentation that had stretched on for more than 2 years, along with falsified reports crafted to deceive every medical regulatory board that should have protected them. Claire, or the woman who once carried that name, knew she could not keep the truth hidden for even one more day. She organized the file, added one last protective layer of encryption to shield the identities of the surviving witnesses, and sent it from a temporary masked server to 3 major media outlets and 1 independent medical watchdog. In the attached email, she left no real name, only a single sentence. "Justice needs no face, only truth." In less than 12 hours, a flood of breaking reports lit up the news cycle, with headlines that struck like a blow to the national conscience. Nexacore gene therapy kills. Leaked data exposes illegal patient trials. Federal investigators moved quickly. The old Nexacore building was sealed again. Former shareholders were summoned, and one by one, board members were taken into custody. That evening, in the small kitchen of the villa, now returning to a fragile order, Claire sat beside Ethan with her hair pulled back, her face marked by exhaustion, though her eyes glowed with a fire he had never seen before. Ethan poured her a cup of hot tea and sat down close enough that his shoulder brushed hers. "The news spread fast," he murmured, his gaze fixed on the television where the government's first live press conference was airing. Claire nodded. I think it needed to be known. Those people deserved better than to be forgotten in silence. They had names, they had families, they were not just numbers. Ethan studied her for a long moment, then took her hand and placed it over his chest where his heart now beat strong and steady. If you had not chosen to speak, no one ever would have known. And if you had not found the courage to face it, I would not have had a second chance. She looked at him, her eyes misting though she held the tears back. I used to be Claire Monroe, a cardiac surgeon inside a broken system. But that woman died the night I lay beside your car. I do not want to be Claire anymore. Ethan tilted his head, his expression soft but certain. Who do you want to be? She drew in a long breath. Emily Hart. He smiled. It is beautiful. It was my mother's name. I want to begin again with the only good memory I still have. Ethan squeezed her hand gently and placed a small box on top of it. Inside it a worn brass key. Then, Emily Hart, this is our new home. No more Chicago. No more villa. No more mafia. No more revenge. We leave. She looked at him with surprise and trust woven together. Are you sure? What about Luca? Everything you built. I once built an empire to fight the emptiness inside me, he said quietly. Now I only want to build a place quiet enough to hear my own heartbeat. The next morning, they left Geneva Lake in silence. Luca stood by the clearing, offering no questions, only a firm pat on Ethan's shoulder and a warm embrace for Claire, as if acknowledging that she had not only saved Ethan, but had saved men who once believed they were beyond saving. The car slipped down the narrow trail, disappearing into the woods, leaving behind a past that had nearly destroyed them both. Claire watched through the rearview mirror as the villa shrank and finally vanished, and inside her there was no fear, no lingering dread, only a single certainty. She had survived, she had saved a life, and she had dared to tell the truth. And Ethan, once the shadow of a city, was now the only light she chose to follow. They did not know what awaited them ahead, but that no longer mattered. They had chosen to walk out of the darkness carrying the truth and a heart that no longer feared death. 6 months later, in a small lakeside town in northern Wisconsin, in a rustic wooden house covered with wildflowers where soft sunlight filtered through the branches, Emily and Ethan began a new kind of life. They no longer used the names they once carried, nor did they drag their past behind them like a shadow weighing down their hearts. Now each morning began with the delicate ring of a small bell at the door of their family clinic, the place they opened together to care for the people in town, to offer routine checkups, and sometimes simply to sit quietly and listen to someone speak a pain they could not name. Ethan, a man who once moved through the world of darkness, had become someone gentle and steady, greeting each patient with a warm hello as he managed the records and welcomed every face with the ease of a neighbor. Emily, in her white coat and with a heart once shattered, returned to medicine with a clarity and devotion born from everything she had survived. In that small space, where the walls were covered in landscape paintings and framed family photos, her heart beat strong and even, no longer afraid that old memories might one day rise and blur the life she was building. Each evening they sat by the lake, where the water reflected the fading sun, and the wind tangled softly through Emily's hair, and Ethan would take her hand just as he had in the villa all those months ago, and tell her in his low, steady voice that no matter what came, he would not leave her. Their story was no longer a death sentence or a desperate escape. It had become a journey of healing. From a man who once lived as though tomorrow did not exist, and a woman stripped of her name and her memory, they found each other, gathered the scattered pieces, and built a home from trust, sacrifice, and love that asked for nothing in return. This story was not merely about fleeing danger or exposing medical secrets. It was about the brave choice to forgive the past and begin again, even when such a choice demanded everything. In that quiet rhythm of life, when children's laughter echoed outside, and an elderly woman knocked on the clinic door to offer thanks for her recovery after months of coughing, Emily understood she did not need to be a renowned surgeon, did not need to save millions. She only needed to save the right person, and she had. Ethan felt the same. Each time he checked his blood pressure and heard his heart beating evenly through the stethoscope, he smiled, knowing that what kept him alive was not the serum, but the love of the woman beside him. If you are watching this video, perhaps you have taken this entire emotional journey with us. What do you think of this story? Did it make you reflect on anything? Have you ever believed that a single kind moment, a single hand reaching out at the right time, could change the course of someone's life? Leave a comment below and share what it stirred within you, from the deepest part of your heart, because sometimes your own story can be the very thing that heals someone else. If you enjoyed this touching journey, do not forget to subscribe to our channel, like the video, and share it, so that each day we can bring you more stories that inspire, comfort, and connect. We look forward to walking with you, listening to you, and reaching your heart one story at a time. Thank you for staying with us until the end. We wish you health, joy, and peaceful days ahead. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.